Welcome to Prison, the Hidden Sentence, raising awareness and providing education and insights for individuals and families with incarcerated loved ones, educating and empowering through personal stories of those affected by and involved with our prison population.
This is Julia Lazareck with Prison, the Hidden Sentence, and today I'm here with David Rothenberg. For those of you who are a part of the approximately 50% of the population in the United States who have or had a loved one in the prison system, you probably know him as the founder of the Fortune Society in New York. Their mission is to support successful reentry from incarceration and promote alternatives to incarceration, thus strengthening the fabric of our communities. And if you go to their website, fortunesociety.org, you'll see on the front page, Building People, Not Prisons. We believe in the power of people to change. We help individuals with justice involvement rebuild their lives through innovative services and advocacy. This is just so powerful to read these words, and we're going to talk more about the Fortune Society in this podcast. But if you're part of the other 50% of the United States population, you probably know David as a Broadway producer, where he's known for producing Fortune and My Eyes, and he also wrote the book Fortune in My Eyes. And this is where we'll start, okay? So welcome, David. I'm so honored to have you on the Prison, the Hidden Sentence podcast, and everyone that's listening is in for a real treat. So thank you for making the time to talk to me today.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and let's start with how you came about producing Fortune and My Eyes.
Okay, which is a Shakespearean sonnet. The title of the play was from Shakespeare's One in disgrace with fortune in men's eyes. I all alone beweep my outcast state. I was working in the theater. I was a publicist. I knew nothing about prison other than old movies. That's my frame of reference. Like most Americans was, Cagney pictures, and they were either escaping or rioting. I didn't know anything about prison, but I worked in the theater, mostly doing publicity, doing well. And I started, I read this play, Fortune in Men's Eyes. It was sent to me by a critic. I read it in one night and was devastated when I read it. It was by a man named John Herbert. It's about a kid who goes into a jail and is raped his first night in prison. It was good theater, but it also rang with a kind of truth that was unmistakable. And I was shocked and angry at myself because I considered myself politically and socially active and sophisticated and knowledgeable. And this was a world I didn't know. But I knew a good play when I read it. So I wrote to John Herbert and I said, I'd love to see this play get on. I showed it. I had never produced at that time. And I showed it to a couple of friends who were successful producers. And they said, nobody's going to want to see a play about a kid going into jail. And I said, well, I'm going to get it on. And this was 1966. A lifetime ago. I raised the money, and it was off-Broadway. It wasn't Broadway, Julia. This kind of a play could have never opened on Broadway back then. It was too startling. It had to find a small theater and find its audience. And we cast the play, and the actors went into rehearsal, and they came to me one day and said, we want to visit a jail, because as actors, they wanted to authenticate the movement and whatnot. And they were playing young men. It was a juvenile facility. So it was arranged for us to go to the adolescent unit on Rikers Island in New York City, and I went with them. And it was my first visit to a jail. It was December of 66, and we spent a full day there. We spent a day watching them being marched around. We spent an hour or two in the dormitories, and I saw teenage boys, almost all of them were just sitting on their beds, looking out. They put us each in a cell for an hour so we could get the feeling of it. They were very nice to us, I may add. But I kept thinking, I'm looking at these boys, and they were big kids, but they were boys. They were 16, 17, and 18. And I remembered the sense of eyes. I could feel the eyes looking. And I thought, this is what my initial instinct in a jail as a person who had no experience with it. And I said this at the meeting with you when I recently met you. Is that I think my greatest strength was the fact that I didn't know, but I kept asking questions. And my reaction to the boys in that jail was, whatever they did that got them there, How could they be any better as a result of this experience? And what would society be inheriting when they came back out? I was interviewed by a theater newspaper backstage, and they asked, they wanted to know all the show business aspects of what we're doing. And I said, and it was a quote that was used, that this is an exercise in institutional futility. And I say that because I have been in jails and prisons, hundreds around the country and in other countries. And I've never changed that initial reaction that it's, and the worst is that I've seen where it was in the States, that it doesn't work. It's the system is counterproductive to the needs of the greater society. Our goal was to do the play, but I was becoming one of those guys that started, there weren't many articles. Let me tell you, back in the 60s, there wasn't that much to read, but I read Bill Sands' book and a couple of other things, newspapers every now and then there'd be an article. And I started reading things and learning about what was happening in jails and prisons. And so when the play opened, and I may add to wildly diverse reviews, some of the critics thought it was one of the most important plays of the year, and others were so shocked by it that they said that it shouldn't be allowed to be seen. One critic actually said that. About 3 weeks after the play opened, I got a call from a professor asking if he could bring he was bringing his students to a performance. Could they stay afterwards for a dialogue? And that was right up my alley. I invited the whole audience. We sent, we put a note in the program. Everybody wants to stay. And almost the whole audience stayed because by the time the play was over, the audience was gasping and they needed to have some feedback. They really wanted a dialogue. And so myself and two of the actors came out on the stage and we invited comments. And they were very laudatory and they were wonderful. And then one man said, I think this play is an exaggeration. Those characters are stereotypes and exaggerated. And from the back of the house, a man stood up and said, none of my 20 years in joints like this counts for anything. You people couldn't watch what we do to each other and what happens. And I said, please come down. I was like Johnny Olson, come on down. And a man named Pat McGarry came down and mesmerized the audience for the next hour talking about state prison, Florida chain gang, San Quentin. I mean, he had been there. And afterwards, we went across the street for coffee. We talked for hours. And I said, Pat, this is important. You have to come back. And he said, everybody knows about that. And I said, nobody knows about it. You may be in a world where everybody knows about it. I'm mainstream America. I'm as square as it can be. This is news to me. You have to come back. And he said, you got to get somebody that did black time. I did white time. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, in most of the prisons, the 60s, he said, New York State, there's black time and white time. We don't mix. And it's two different times. I said, well, I don't know. You're the only person I ever met that did time other than the playwright. And he said, well, I work in a laundry shop and in a tailor shop. And I have a customer. He said, we don't talk about it, but we read each other. And he came back the following week with a man named Clarence Cooper, who was African-American and who did time in Milan, Michigan at a Fed joint. And they were totally opposite. Pat was flamboyant and outspoken. Clarence was intense and intellectual. It was almost like you were casting it for a movie. You couldn't have gotten better. And they loved doing it because it was almost therapy for them because they had never talked about. Clarence was in a relationship. The woman came to those sessions. She didn't know any of the things that he had gone through. And it was very therapeutic. And so because I was a good publicity person, called a theater editor of the New York Times and said, this is a story. And he sent a reporter down and the headline was, the drama continues after the curtain falls. And it said that every Tuesday night we were having these dialogues at the theater. And the following Tuesday night when we started, I suddenly realized in the audience was a whole different population. There were at least a dozen guys. And I keep saying men because it was a couple of years before women came forward for lots of obvious reasons. But these guys all had something to say. And then all of us went across the street to the coffee place afterwards and had coffee. And when I discovered that these men somebody had given them the article, they either read it or somebody passed it on to them. Almost every one of them was in AA, and that they had a place to go to deal with that. They all said that, if they stayed sober, they stayed out of trouble. But what came out of that and future Tuesday nights is that their rage about their prison experience had not been expressed, that they had deeply felt anger about what the system had done to them and was continuing to do to them, because jobs, housing, one of the guys couldn't, his wife signed the lease. It was demeaning to him. Another man said, my grandmother thinks I was in North Carolina working on a farm for 3 years. He lied to her. So there was lies to people you loved. There were jobs you couldn't get. Or one guy was working he was a gypsy taxi driver with a fake license, all endangering their freedom, but surviving. I was discovering not only was the system inside horrendous, the punishment continued when they were out. And I started getting phone calls from people in the audience. This was the late 60s when there was a lot of social activism and protesting, but this was an unheard group. And a lot of these guys are joining us on the stage on Tuesday nights. And I started getting calls from teachers and ministers. Could you come and speak to our group? And I was suddenly on the circuit going to college classes, high school classes, Rotary clubs, Presbyterian church suppers. We did that for about 6 months. And one night at the theater, I said, we have the nucleus of an organization. What we could do is, what has to be done is educate the people. Because if they knew what was going on, we could change the system. I had no vision beyond that. Boy, was I naive. And we decided to take the play's title, The Fortune of Men's Eyes, and call it The Fortune Society. 16 people gave me $2, and we opened a bank account for $32 at Chemical Bank. And I like to say we outlasted Chemical Bank because Chase bought them out. And my little theater office on 46th Street, I was still working in the theater. I was doing publicity on Broadway shows like Hair, and I was representing plays by Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee. And my theater office became headquarters for the Fortune Society. And we said we were going to keep in touch with people by mimeographing a newspaper. Anybody under 50 doesn't know what a mimeograph machine is. It was the prequel to Xeroxing, I guess, wasn't it? Or an email.
Yeah. I don't know.
But this is significant because it was like 3 or 4 pieces of paper just saying what we were doing. And men in prison started hearing about it, asking for copies. And this was significant because the warden at Attica banned it, saying it was revolutionary. There was nothing in it except us saying where we were going. Well, because they said it was revolutionary, we started getting all sorts of letters from men in Attica. This is 1969 and 70. And a law student named Steve Shostakowski, who volunteered with us, he was a Columbia law student, got a law firm, and they challenged the banning of our newspaper. And Fortune versus McGinnis has become, and still is, a landmark censorship issue, which says that when you lock somebody up, you don't have the right to deny them what they can read. And I say that because there are still prisons that ban literature, and they're doing it against the law. And the men and women incarcerated don't know the law. Why that was significant is because, well, I'll get to that. As a publicity person, we started doing radio programs, and guys were using fake names so they wouldn't be caught. And then there was a national syndicated program called the David Susskind Show. The nearest thing to it for people of today was Oprah. Oprah had that kind of a program. And Susskind had always had, it was on Sunday nights and in New York, but played around the country. And he had always interesting topics: 6 recovering addicts, 6 gamblers, 6 lesbians, all sorts of things. Could never get formerly incarcerated people to talk about their imprisonment because of the fear of what would happen to them, jobs lost and whatnot. But some of our guys said they would go on. And Susskind ran the program, and on a Sunday night. And at the end of it, he said, these men are all part of a new organization, the Fortune Society, 1545 Broadway, which is my address, my theater address, office. And the next day when I arrived at my office, which is on the 6th floor of a 6th-floor building in Times Square in Manhattan, the stairwell from top to bottom was filled with guys who had seen the show, thinking they were coming to this big, thriving organization because they saw these 4 terrific guys expounding on what's wrong with the system. And they were coming in, the guys came in, I need a job, I need housing. And there's me sitting there with my theater posters. I didn't know what to do with them, one after the other, telling them, we don't have jobs. No, I don't have housing. No, we don't have no drug program. His name was Kenny Jackson. He came over to me and said, what the you doing, do you? And I said, help. And he said, move over. I'm a drunk. We talk to each other. And he literally became the first counselor right there. And later in the day, a man named Mel Rivers came in, African-American from Bed-Stuy. I said, we don't have jobs. He said, I'm not looking for a job. I just want to know what you guys are up to. And he and Kenny hit it off. Melvin was working as a gypsy taxi driver. Kenny was working as a trucker with a fake license. In retrospect, I realized that they had great leadership ability, and they both knew this was something they wanted to do. And we had a nucleus right then. This is about 6 months after Fortune really began. And we started going around places and talking. And that Susskind program, we got brought out to Chicago and met Carl Menninger. And then Attica jumped off in 71. Do you remember? Were you around during the Attica? No,
I've heard you guys speak about it.
Well, the men inside took over the yard, and they, in protest about the conditions, and they didn't trust the city or the state in negotiations, and they asked for outside observers to come in. And they made a list of people who they would accept and that the state would accept. And I got a call from Assemblyman Arthur Reeves saying, the inmates want you to come to Attica. And it was as a result of our fight for the censorship to get our little measly newspaper into Attica. And they thought we were this thriving organization. So I said, I'll come up, but I didn't have much experience with prison riots. And I said, I won't come alone. Could Kenny Jackson and Mel Rivers come with me? And they said yes. And the three of us did go into the yard. And the takeover of the yard, and subsequently the state going in, killing 33 men and 9 hostages, it was the news story around the world, certainly around the country, lead story on all the television news and the newspapers. And in New York City, we were the only game in town for the media. We had every day for weeks afterwards, we had a lot of guys who had been in Attica. They wanted our perspective. So we grew incredibly as a result of Attica. And men started coming to us. I had to make a choice about 2 careers. Was I going to stay in the theater or is this what I wanted to do?
It's a tough decision. Yeah.
Those of you who have been involved with nonprofit organizations may find this interesting. I got a call from a man. He was a lawyer, and he said, I have a client, anonymous, who wants to make a $5,000 grant to your organization. He's supporting grassroots groups. What is your 501c3? And I said, what does that mean? He said, your nonprofit status. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, oh, my God, you really are grassroots, don't you? He said, no, you need a nonprofit status so you can raise money. And I said, okay, now what do I do? And he said, I'll help you. Through the Attorney General's office in New York, he got us the nonprofit status. Kenny, Melvin, and I went on salary at $100 a week in 71, I think. There was a long time I was working both in the theater and on my job. New York is going on outside. Can you hear it?
Just a little bit.
We started growing from that. And one of the interesting things, we were in this building on 46th Street and Broadway, which was almost all theater people. And it became the safest building in Times Square at a time when there was a lot of trouble. And the people in the building were always hiring. Do you have a guy that we can get for a day's work to do some painting? Do you have a guy that we're unloading some stuff in? And the word was out around Times Square is don't mess with that building because a lot of guys came for coffee and we started collecting clothes. But then we got so big we wanted to move. And we had trouble finding a place that would take us because of who we were. And the place where we were started petitioning to keep us. And they made space for us to move out of my 1 room into 3 rooms so that they could keep us in the building. But that was only for another year because by then we were bursting at our seams. And we finally found an area which at that time was reconstructing. And so we got in there. But it's interesting that every time we wanted to move, which is 4 times because we're getting bigger, the new places didn't want us, and the old place where we were said we were such good neighbors and made the building so safe that they wanted to keep us. But it's an interesting paradox about, not in my backyard thing. We're going through it now with one of our residents, some people in the North Bronx. Oh, we don't want them there. And yet where we have a residence, I'll get to all of that. The people were part of the community. Anyway, Fortune grew from that beyond my wildest dreams. People say, what was your vision? To get through the day was my vision. And people coming in with problems. I was a middle-class kid working in the theater. I was hearing life stories almost every day. Somebody came in, it was like a 3-act play or a drama movie that you couldn't believe. And I was making friends of people who had lives that, I never met people who were abandoned at birth and faced the death penalty and did 25 years and then came out and, hi, Dave, how can I help? the paradox was just overwhelming. And it committed me to something bigger than me. And that's what Fortune Society came in my life. And boy, was I lucky. It was an arena at that time that was hungry for advocacy. And that was my gift. My gift was because my background was in public relations and publicity and theater. I was able to be an advocate for a population that had no voice beforehand. And as we grew and we started hiring people, it was the people coming into us that defined what our needs were. Counseling was obvious. This is literally how we started our education program. One of our guys, Danny Keene, was a very effective speaker talking about his experience. And he said to me one day, David, I don't want to go to any more colleges. I feel ignorant in front of those people. They're so smart. And I said, your story has to be heard. And standing there was one of our volunteers, a woman named Melanie Johnson. And she said, Danny, I'm a retired teacher. I'll tutor you and you can build up your vocabulary and your grammar. And he said, okay. And Melanie came to me about 3 weeks later and she said, David, I now have 5 students who need another teacher, volunteer. And that's how our education department built, because the people coming to us defined it. Housing became a need because people coming in saying, I don't have, they're putting me in shelters, single room occupancy hotels. I remember this guy, Prentice Williams, said, if I have to go back there one night, I'd rather go back to prison. It's filled with drugs. There's violence all over. I want something else in my life. I won't go back there. And Kenny, Melvin, and I, and then other people, our first, quote, halfway house were the sofas in our living room. For a few years, that was it. I must have had 50 different men and a few women who stayed with me as time went by, as all of us did. And some of our supporters started making it available. So we knew housing was important. And eventually the castle became our model residence, the Fortune Academy. But that wasn't until the year 2000 when it opened, 22 years ago.
When you say the castle, could you explain what that is?
Yeah. Well, let me say this, that I stayed at Fortune for 20 years. It was growing so big, and I knew that it needed to go in another direction. My gift was what I did, grassroots and advocacy. And I said, it needs somebody else. And Joanne Page, who had started as a volunteer when she was at Yale Law School and is the child of Holocaust survivors, was almost the perfect person. But beyond that, so organized, so bright. And when she took over, and I said, I went back and did some theater work, but became a full-time volunteer at Fortune. And we talked a lot about housing. And they found this abandoned building in Harlem at 140th and Riverside Drive. It had been a Catholic girls' school and then a crack house. And she negotiated and got the building, and we converted it. And there was a lot of protest from the neighborhood. Actually, when we opened it, they picketed. And it's a residence for 75 men and women formerly incarcerated, all homeless. And every Thursday night, there's a community meeting with the executive team, meeting with the residents. And I went to the first one. I've been going every Thursday for the last 22 years. It's the shape of culture. It's for people who have been, well, institutionalized people. How do they break the cycle? Well, you have to create an atmosphere of trust, and that's the toughest part. Getting people to express their feelings and feeling comfortable enough, because if they've come out of our jail and prison system in America, they're not ready to share and to open up. And the castle has been an incredible experiment, and I've watched lives not everybody makes it, and we have a second chance and a third chance policy. Joanne always said, if you've been drugging for 30 years, don't think a 30-day program is going to get you a free pass. Relapse is part of recovery. And we have a lot of people who have been second and third times at the castle, which is different than most, quote, it's not a halfway house, but I've gone around the country and looked at halfway houses, most of which are run by parole or correction. They don't have second chances, and they don't create an atmosphere that allows people to open up. And I think best example, I was on the subway and the guy yelled, David, and it was one of the residents downtown. And I said, where you headed, Eddie? And he said, I'm going home. And he was referring to going back to the castle as home. That's the first time I heard that. I said, that's it. And then to myself, I said, we've succeeded, at least with Eddie. He's going home. He's not going to the place, or he was going home. And another thing I've learned is, as I've said, we've been there 22 years. I said to one of the guys, I haven't seen Joey. I can't remember who it was. He left the castle in a couple of years. How's he doing? And one of the other guys, alumni, because a lot of the alumni come back to the Thursday meeting, said, oh, he's fine. I talk to him every morning on what are those things that you all carry, you young people?
Oh, the cell phone?
Yeah. Well, I found out that there was a network of about 18, 19 men and women who had all gotten to know each other while at the castle. And without any guidance from us, they stay in touch with each other every day, just saying, hey, is everything okay? And if you need anything, call me. And sometimes they need things. But
yeah, they probably text. Yeah, that makes sense.
They text people. I knew it was a big word.
Yeah.
And I found that fascinating. But that's a result of creating a place that was supportive, that gave them an opportunity. I think that's very exciting. So the castle was our first residence, and then we had a backyard, and we built a second building, which is permanent residence. The castle is temporary. It's you come in and you learn how to prepare to go back into society. You can make mistakes here with us. So, I remember one guy said, that guy down the hall, his music is too loud, and at the Thursday meeting, it came up and somebody said, what are you going to do when you move into your own building if somebody's making noise? It's going to happen. It's nothing unique with your situation there. How do you deal with situations like that? And so do we set up a committee? Do you have a tenants committee? Do you get together and talk about how to respect each other when people have all come from prison life? Fortune has a main office now in Long Island City, Queens. Believe it or not, we have a staff of 400 people, which includes all the temporary residents, all our residents. We have 2 residents in the Bronx. One, the city came to us during the pandemic and said, we're letting people out of Rikers Island. We will give you a building if you will run it for us, because we invite political people and media people to come to see what we're doing. And they picked us to do what they didn't think they were able to do. And so that's our second house. And then the third house, a religious group was building a residence for seniors, and a beautiful building. And they said they wanted half of the residents to be from the Fortune Society and the other half their church people. And that's one of our residence hours for people over 65 who have come out of prison. And we're taking a big hotel that's been abandoned in 96th Street and Broadway, and that'll be ready in a year. So, and Joanne Page has done extraordinary work in creating housing options for formerly incarcerated men and women to give them a support system. 50% of the people coming out of institutions in New York are homeless, 50%. And they want to know why there's crime on the street. They want to know why there's recidivism. And a lot of people who have been maintained on Thorazine and other drugs in prison don't have continuity when they come out. Those are all things that have to be talked about. Now, our advocacy continues to talk about things like that, but we also have to address the reality of it, that we have people who are not on their meds who can't function off their meds and get in trouble when they're off their meds. It's a lot. The bottom line, Julia, is when we talk to people is when they say, how do you reduce crime? My answer is one person at a time. That people who change their lives, Taz Torres has given me blanket permission to talk about him all the time. He came to the castle the late 30s, and he said at a meeting that at the age of 10, he was introduced to weed and wine, and that's how he dealt with his pain. And when he came to the castle, he sat in on the Thursday night meetings, slouching, unshaven, looking like I would rather be anywhere else in the world. And I watched him each week, and I watched each week his posture got better. There was less his physical. He started combing his hair, do other things. Years later, he told me, he said, when you get into a lot of institutions, you sit around and you try and find out who's serious and who's not. And that's what he was doing. And after about 7 or 8 weeks, he spoke. He said something in a meeting, and I whispered to Joanne, he talks too. Well, he became not only a talker, but one of my closest friends and a marvelous man who became a counselor. He still works for Fortune. I watched his kids grow up. His daughter and son are part of Fortune. His son is now a teacher. He was taken away from his mother when he was 6. The father wasn't there. The mother was alcoholic, and they took away all the children. They scattered them around the state. That's what they do with kids. There was no plan, no nothing. And he said to me, David, I had to learn how to trust. And he said, you all in this building made me feel like maybe. And I said, well, we're on trial all the time. He said, no, the trial's over. But you were on trial. How to prove it? And there's lots of Kaz's, lots of Kaz stories. Kaz Emeritorius, a remarkable man. And he's so smart. And I think, what he could have been. And I said to him, how come you know so much? And he said, he learned how to read early, and he always had a book in his back pocket. And his joke is Mark Twain, Jack London, and Superman saved him from a lot of pain. And he traveled in that world. He got lost in the world of books, and he's always telling me, I read this good book. You got to get a hold of this. But he's only one of many. It's just that we've gotten close. And I'm close to his wife and his kids, their family.
There's just so much that you've shared with us. And we have a lot of families that are listening. And I think one of the things is we're healing people. You're healing people that are coming out of prison. You've provided a place for them to come where they can grow, where they can learn, because we know that they've been institutionalized. We know that it's not the same person coming out. We know a lot of people have been traumatized. So when I talk to people that haven't met anybody, kind of like where you were in the beginning and I was before my brother was incarcerated, they don't care. They don't think about people that are incarcerated as people. And when they come out, how we can help them be contributing citizens to society. So I wanted to ask you is from the people that you've met that have been incarcerated, that are coming out, the people that you've helped, how can people on the outside, family members, and even people that are just listening and learning about this for the first time, how can they help?
Well, you and I have both talked to people in different parts of the country, and it's rather scary because we moved so much here in New York, and then I talked to somebody in New Mexico or Wyoming and find out that, or North Carolina, and that they have a relative coming out and there's nothing for them. The families are left with the burden that they're often not prepared to handle. That's why groups like yours exist, because they get feedback from other families. I've gone to, there are programs. We've gone to different states. I've gone to Colorado. I've gone to Charlotte, North Carolina. People call up and say, can we start a Fortune Society here? And I say, we don't want to be a national organization because everything is about the local, but you can come and visit us and we'll come and visit you and you can emulate what we do and try and create a program. I tell them if they want to get started, try to find a church that is committed to social justice so that they can have a place to meet. May not be a church, but that's always a good starting point. And to let AA groups and NA groups know that there is a program, because you'll find that many of the people have been incarcerated in groups like that, and have the understanding of group dynamics and how the importance of it. And they can be helpful and very pragmatic things. You and I were talking about the meeting that which I met you, where a woman, was she from Nevada, where she said her father came out for a pass for 3 days.
That was in New Mexico.
New Mexico. And they went to a big store and he ran out because it was so overwhelming and that he couldn't make decisions. And then one of the women from Long Island said, David, remember Angel from Fortune? Tell that story. And Angel at a Thursday night meeting at the castle talked about he went away when he was 18. He came out when he was 40, and he said he couldn't go into drugstores or supermarkets because it just dazzled him. It scared him. And because he was in an environment that he was comfortable enough to share that, 2 other guys in the room said, me too. They were going through the same thing, and the 3 of them started shopping together. They called them 3 men in a shopping cart. And they supported each other. They made themselves realize that a lot of this was people laughing at them and nobody really cared what they were doing. But I was excited by the fact that 10 years ago, Angel said that at a Fortune meeting, and somebody heard it and was at your meeting then. And then now somebody in Nevada, in New Mexico, can try and implement something like that. That's what happened with the meeting I sat in with you, is people were sharing information. It ain't easy. But at the castle, one of our guys early said, the answer's in the room. You just have to ask the question. Now, of course, we say the answer's in the Zoom. Everybody who's going through something thinks that they've invented this problem, and they find out others are through it. I remember at a Thursday night meeting at the castle, a new guy wanted to get his license. He talked about it. He was a truck driver before, and they're giving him this trouble and that trouble. And the guy across from him said, all right, here's what you do. And the guy said, what do you mean? He said, I faced it. Here's what I did, and here's what I got. The answer was in the room. Thankfully, the man talked about it, because sometimes, especially guys who have done a lot of time and become institutionalized, get so frustrated that they think going back is easier than, they throw a brick to go back in. They actually say, well, I think the woman from New Mexico said her father said he wanted to get back in. It was easier for him.
Yeah, it's difficult on the outside. And I think what you said is helpful, that the answer's in the room, that people should continue getting together, that people should continue sharing information.
But the room has to be created not judgmental and supportive. If it's judgmental, how could you have done that, or how can you be so stupid? You know, things that adults say to kids all the time, which closes them up. I think you have to create a room of trust and comfort so people will express their frustrations about, this is a New York City problem. There might be equivalents in other places. The subways are so crowded during the rush hour, and people push. And inside, if you don't push back, you're perceived as a target. But when you're outside on parole and you push back, you can get violated. So we talk about that. What do you do if you're going to get pushed on the subway? Because guarantee you're going to get pushed. How are you going to handle it? By talking about it, people are prepared for the fact. Some guys say, I arranged to go to work off rush hours, which means he goes at 6 instead of 8. And I said, eventually you may get tired and want to show up at 8. But we talk about it. And the answers aren't easy because you're dealing with feelings and years. The wisest thing I ever heard, a man named Larry White came to the castle. He had done about 25 years. And he was wise because he had the insight of what he was going through. He told the group, he said, to survive in prison, I had to put on jackets of protection, one after the other. He said, living there year after year, these are not real jackets. These are figurative cloaks of protection. And he said, that's how I got through it. I protected myself with all these coats. He said, now I'm out here. You will have to help me take them off. And that became a challenge. And that was 15 years ago. And every time I see Larry, I said, any coats left? And they're all gone. The fact that he recognized that his metaphor was so clear and precise, and so many other people identified with that. And he was a stand-up guy who had done all this time, and he's putting it out there. Made it easier for other guys to say, yeah, me too. I don't know what to do. We talk about relationships. There was a guy terrific guy, and he met a woman and he moved in with her. He was at the castle 6 weeks and gone. He came back and he said, Jesus, she wants me to do this. She wants me to do that. And I said, well, relationships are not just about good. And then I said to him, and then I looked at the group and I said, the golden fuck is not a relationship. And the whole room froze because I don't swear and I'm older than all of them. But if you use something like that and you know who you're talking to and they know you, it has an impact. And I've had a lot of guys come back to me and say, boy, were you right about that? You know, you move in with a woman, and we have women who get into relationships with men and they recreate the worst relationships they had. It's a phenomenon. Women who have the bad men find other bad men to see if they can get one worse. I remember this guy said, I thought it was great. You know, I'm moving into her apartment. And then in a few weeks, she wanted to know if I was going to start paying half the rent. He said, I'm going to school. I don't have a job yet. And then she wanted to know about paying for half the food. And then she wanted to know about, I said, well, that's what relationships are. It's not a free ticket. And he said, I think I got to come back to the castle. And I said, you got to come back to the castle and learn how to have a relationship before you go into one. It's not just good. And he said, oh, the golden fuck. And I said, right, right.
You know, and that's what people on the outside have to realize, too, that somebody's been incarcerated and they're coming out and that they don't actually understand everything right away because things have changed.
That haven't been in prison don't. So just to add to that, I tell the guys that. I say, you know, you don't have exclusivity on this. You just have it more intense because you've been locked up. And the women who come in many have had terrible experiences with men. My dear friend Helen, who said to me, she said, David, you're the first man I've trusted in 20 years. I couldn't talk to men. She was so afraid because I didn't ask for details. She's a beautiful human being, and she's learning at 60 to have the life that she always deserved that she should have.
And that's a good point, that people deserve to have a good life. They've served their time, they're coming out, and society should support them. There was something you said that right now, greater society is paying for a system that doesn't work. And that's something that we want to raise awareness with, that what's happening in the way we treat people is not helping them. It's not healing them. they're serving their sentence, but we still need to be able to help them when they get out so that they can thrive, because they're not getting help when they're incarcerated.
One of my wise friends, Sam Rivera, said, they sent me to prison, and that was my punishment. Nobody told them they had to punish me every day. That was not what the judge asked for. He said, what I had to learn was, why was I there? Nobody ever asked him. He was asked, why are you there? And his first answer was, well, I got 12 cops came and arrested me. This was a therapist discussion. The therapist said, no, why were you there? And he said, well, I was selling drugs on the street. She said, no. Why did a smart guy like you put yourself in a position where you could be killed or locked up when you had other options? What happened in your life that you made those choices? That's when the hard work begins, is to figure out, why have you made those choices? One of the guys that runs our meeting many nights, different people do, but Stanley Richards, one of the wisest men, he says, look in the mirror tonight and ask that person, who are you and who do you want to be? He said, when you start asking that person, and I remember one night, Irvin Hunt called Easy, came back third time. He did well at the meetings. He charmed everybody, did everything right. And then he went out and would get high when he got his own apartment. So when he came back a third time at the meeting on Thursday, I have permission to share this. So I'm not saying any, he talks about that in public. So I'm not breaking confidence. He said, tell them all, David. Stanley said, Easy, what are you going to do? And what do you want to be? What do you want to do? And Stanley said, when you're here in a meeting, you charm us, you amuse us, you inspire us. What about you? And Easy started to answer it. And Stanley said, you don't have to answer any of us. The only person you have to answer is you. When you go back to your place tonight, look in the mirror, and that's when the hard work begins. What do you want? Do you have to go into an NA group? Do you have to go into therapy? Or is it a religious thing with you? To find out, why did you do this? Listen, the traumas of the past, as you know, Julia, some of the stories we've heard, horrendous stories about childhoods. You think you've heard every story, and then you'll hear of a man who's came to the castle doing well, and as I got to know him well, told me he witnessed his father killing his mother, and he was about 8 years old. And I said, what happened with you then? He said, all the relatives were in Puerto Rico. They just put me in a kid's home. I said, did you have any counseling, any therapy? None. The mother was dead. The father was in prison, and he saw it. How could you not have? He became an addict. He became a user of drugs because his life was beyond imagination. And then he ended up in a place where he could talk about that. And we said, how do you feel about yourself? And are you ready to talk to us? Do you want to go into a therapist? One of the things that Fortune has developed, which is one of the most important units, is it's called the Better Living Center, where we have therapists and group therapy. And it's a population that is very resistant to it. I ain't crazy. I ain't going in. But the best ambassadors for that are their brothers and sisters who have done time with them and said, it ain't a weakness. It's a sign of strength. Go, do what I did. We don't have to recruit people. They recruit each other. But therapy may not be for everybody, but it ain't bad. So is NA, AA. You deal with all those. God, that Bob Brown, an old timer years ago, said, we suffer from the crocodiles of our dreams. And I said, what a vivid image. And Bob said to me, David, when I look back on my childhood, I don't ever remember being hugged, and I don't remember the sun shining. Obviously, the sun shined. He said, but I was locked in a closet somewhere. That little boy of 5 and 6 can't process all of it. You know who Darryl Strawberry is Darryl Strawberry, great baseball player. You're not a sports player.
No, I'm not.
Well, I tell this story because older guys appreciate this. Darryl Strawberry is a great baseball player, came from the Mets. I loved him. He looked like the man everybody wanted to be. He was 6'6". He was handsome, African-American, had a great build, a great ball player. You could see that his teammates loved him. He was a leader in every sense of the word. And after he finished playing ball, he became a user of drugs. In therapy, and I think in a book or an article that I read, he told the story that when he hit a home run and he was rounding the bases and 50,000 people were yelling, Darryl, Darryl, he said to himself, what would they be yelling if they really knew who I was? Which is an incredible statement, because who he was this idol of millions and adored by the people that are close to him. And he told the story that all through his childhood, he had a father who told him, you're nothing, you'll never be anything, you're a piece of shit. And when you're 5 and 6 and 7, and the man who's in charge of your life, you don't process that, you become that. If you don't have anybody, if you don't have an adult, a grandmother or somebody to saying you're special, you're beautiful, you're wonderful. Daryl grew up with all those talents, not knowing that he had them. Now he does.
Yeah, everybody does.
Everybody needs somebody.
They do. And I hope that people that are listening to this reach out, get the support they need, talk to people, talk to safe people, find safe, compassionate, non-judgmental environments. You can always reach out to Prison, the Hidden Sentence. And also, David has a radio show. So do you want to wrap up and tell us about that? And we'll put that in the
Well, I've been doing it since Marconi invented radio. I've been on I'm on WBAI in New York, Saturday mornings, 8 to 10, Mondays from 10 to 12. I play music, I interview people, I read books, talk about books and movies. And of course, I talk about a lot of things at the Fortune Society, criminal justice stuff. I said this at the beginning, and it's something I've come to understand, that this may be my closing. Looking back, 55 years and Fortune has grown, and I am so proud of how it's people who have come after me, how they've shaped it and all that they've done. My great gift at the beginning, besides the fact that I was a publicist and I knew how to work the media and all of that, was that I didn't know anything about the system, and I kept asking why. It didn't work. And I found that people, especially guys who had done time, well, everybody knows this. No, they don't. People don't know that. You have to visit a jail and you say, my God. I remember before Attica Riot, you know how they communicated with, they didn't talk to the inmates. They tapped the stick, and that meant go or stop. And the black inmates will tell you that they referred to them as nigger sticks because they hit them with that. The guards, that's how they referred it to. So when you go to a place like that, you hear that, you see that. And then when you become politically sophisticated and you go to an ACA, American Correctional Association convention, and you go into the field house and see the vendors and the big money that's being made and the people who have an investment in keeping a prison going. And then you find out why effective programs are cut, because if they're working and people don't come back, there's a loss of money. Not only the loss of jobs by the correction staff, the vendors, that's where the big money is. This is when the Rockefeller drug law passed. Around the country, prisons and jails were built, and the steel companies and the cement companies and the people that make inflammable blankets and the people that make toilet seats that can't, they weren't selling them by the twos. They were selling them by the 10,000s to new institutions. And when you see that, remember that movie, Follow the Money? Think that Tom Cruise movie? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can learn a lot. My wind-up is that, and I say this because I pass it on to people. Reach me at Fortune Society, D. Rothenberg at fortunesociety.org.
Okay, and we'll have that in the transcript.
I'm retired and old. There are younger people doing it. If you have questions and information, I've developed the art of passing it on, referring it. That's what you do in your twilight years.
Yeah, you have this wealth of knowledge. I mean, David attended a meeting and spoke at the Prison Families Alliance meeting. And we stayed on just another hour because people were just asking him questions because of just what he's been through and what he started and what he's seen. And, like you said, people that haven't been in a prison don't realize how horrible it can be and how it affects our loved ones. And people just need to be aware of it. And
Julia, can I ask you this? I told you we now have a staff of 400. At least 200 of the people at Fortune probably don't know our history. Can they get this link?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. We will get you this link. Everybody will have the history, and it's on all platforms, and you'll have the link to the website, which is prisonthehiddensentence.com.
Do they only hear it, or do they see us too?
They're just going to hear it.
Okay. I'm learning the world of podcasts. It's a whole new world for me. So I didn't have to comb my hair. Let me add this. Can I say one more thing?
Yes, you can. I love it. Yes. You
just laughed at something I said. And one of the things that people coming to Fortune have always said, they're so surprised that there's much laughter. Laughter is healing. Laughter is very healing. It creates an atmosphere where people can laugh. It also creates trust. And on that, I say good night.
Okay. Hi, this is Julia, and we're offering workshops like reentry for families on the outside to prepare them for when their incarcerated loved one is released. You can sponsor someone to attend one of the Prison the Hidden Sentence workshops for as little as $50. If you're looking ways to advertise your business, you can promote your business on a Prison the Hidden Sentence podcast. For more information, email contact@prisonthehiddensentence.com. You can also purchase the Prison the Hidden Sentence book on Amazon.
You can hear more stories or share your story at prisonthehiddensentence.com and follow us at Hidden Sentence on Facebook and Twitter. We are Prison the Hidden Sentence, raising awareness one story at a time.